A quick warning that today's episode discusses child victims of sexual assault.
That's what keeps me up at night, is that process that if I say, yes, you deserve to have an abortion, I could go to jail and lose my license. If I say, no, we can't do your procedure, then they don't get a procedure. We can do everything that we can to get them out of state, but in the end, that may or may not happen.
Do you want to start or you want me to start?
I did it last time, so you should do it this time.
Okay. Welcome to Outlawed. I'm Dr. Beverly Gray here with Dr. Jonas Swartz, and we are talking about what it's like to be criminalized as a provider.
Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Caitlin Bernard, a provider from Indiana who we both admire for her bravery and for the outstanding care she provides, who had one of the most public attempts at criminalization for providing legal care. Caitlin found herself in the middle of national outrage about strict abortion restrictions as a provider in Indiana. So at the time, Ohio had a 6-week ban that did not have exceptions for rape or incest. And Caitlin was the provider in Indiana who was caring for an Ohio child who had been raped and needed an abortion beyond 6 weeks.
This is a 10-year-old child. And imagining, so as a parent, imagining myself in that parent's shoes, having a child that was pregnant by rape, and needing to travel to another state for care because she was just beyond the 6-week ban in their state. Like, that's already just such a heartbreaking story. And then for the provider providing that care to be targeted and subject to just really vile commentary about her and her practice that is also heartbreaking. And to see how brave she was in the setting of all of that is totally admirable. When you're providing care for families that are facing these circumstances, I don't know. I mean, it's just, those are some of the hardest days I've had at work.
I grew up in a family that was really kind of influential in terms of feeling like our world is a community and that you need to kind of find what it is that you have to contribute to that community. And I had the opportunity to work in Puerto Rico and Guatemala with my dad, who's a carpenter, but also a community organizer and working in health clinics. We were working at a rural health clinic in Guatemala and really kind of like bare bones in terms of what we could do. But there was a woman who came and had a baby recently and had just continued to bleed. And there was really nothing that we could do for that. But we were kind of like very high up in the mountains. So like long travel to any type of a hospital, which is what she needed, and kind of figuring out how we were going to get her there. And, just kind of seeing that the way that our health systems similarly were really not like well designed to really provide care for people, and particularly for women. And so I knew pretty young that I felt like medicine was the way to do that. So the two places that I was getting clinical experience for my own experience, but also to build an application to medical school, was I was working as a volunteer doula at the hospital, and then working in the abortion clinic, mostly providing options counseling and mostly observing, not really learning. And I remember very clearly a woman who was in labor. She was having complications and she needed a C-section, and she didn't have anybody with her and she didn't speak any English. Like somehow I ended up, as the non-medical provider, like trying to get the translator on the phone and like to try to explain to her. And she's like on all fours, and we're going to the operating room. And I think just feeling like that these were just incredibly potentially traumatic, potentially very important, pivotal moments in people's lives. and that you could be there for them, and that was a time that people needed a lot of support, both in their delivery and in their abortion care.
Dr. Bernard is an academic clinician, much like Jonas and I are. She works in an academic hospital setting, teaching residents, providing general OBGYN care. So much like us, she delivers babies, she does gynecologic procedures, and she also runs the complex family planning clinic at her hospital.
And then she also works at Planned Parenthood, providing abortion care. And since Indiana's strict abortion law has taken effect, she now travels to an adjacent state, to Illinois, to provide that Planned Parenthood abortion care.
As soon as Dobbs came down, the question was what was going to happen in Indiana and Kentucky. Is Kentucky's trigger ban going to go into effect? And is there a way for us to prevent that from happening? Knowing particularly that, Kentucky, if we could keep it open, would be an access point for southern states and serving kind of like a pretty wide swath of Western Kentucky. I'm not like super good with the geography, but, that was the first thing that was really hard. And then, the trigger ban did go into effect. That was really hard because I think we had some optimism that was in the end unsuccessful to try to keep that clinic open.
Dr. Bernard mentions trigger bans, which is a term that we should define again. So those were laws that were on the books prior to the Dobbs decision that said if Roe v. Wade is ever overturned, abortion is immediately illegal, or abortion is banned beyond 6 weeks in this state. And so there were a bunch of states across the country that had these trigger bans on the books attached to abortion restrictions. And when the Dobbs decision came out, they then had to implement these abortion bans.
Right. And so on the day of the Dobbs decision, there were some clinics like Bridget Amiri describes in her episode, in episode 2, that immediately had to, send patients away because the trigger ban went into effect right away.
And part of the confusing part was that there was some variability in terms of when particular trigger bans took effect. So was it 14 days? Was it 30 days? It was totally arbitrary.
Right. And then for patients, they don't understand the nitty-gritty of the law and may assume that when a law is passed, it goes into effect immediately, which is often not the case. There's usually a timing when the law will go into place. Even in North Carolina, the law was voted, SB 20, our abortion ban, was voted into place in May of 2023, but didn't go into effect until July.
So the time right after Dobbs was a time where clinical practice was completely changing for Dr. Bernard.
Right. And I think we noticed in our region as well that there were many shifting laws. Things changed month to month. And it was hard for us to keep up with what was happening in neighbor states. And even in our own state, things were changing. And so this, for Dr. Bernard, was a critical time for advocacy and for getting involved in speaking out to protect the rights of her patients.
And in this particular case, Ohio had just implemented a very strict 6-week ban that didn't have exceptions for rape. And so she was caring for a 10-year-old rape victim who traveled to Indiana from Ohio to be able to access care and spoke out because Indiana was considering its own abortion ban. They were considering convening a special legislative session to pass a highly unpopular, almost total abortion ban. And so Dr. Bernard spoke out saying, you know what, I recently cared for a patient who, if you pass this ban, this is exactly the type of patient who will not be able to get care.
Exactly. And so really as a clinician who provides this care and who sees the whole, spectrum of people that come to us seeking care, we feel obligated to speak out on their behalf and to maintain laws that can protect access.
So Dr. Bernard spoke out advocating against Indiana's future abortion ban, and that's when she became a big public target.
Right. So the story was widely reported in the news. It was reported internationally in the news. People were targeting Caitlin, calling her a liar. They were saying she'd made this case up just to get attention. And she and her family were unsafe for a period of time because she was being threatened.
And one of her biggest persecutors was the Attorney General of Indiana, Todd Rokita. And here's a clip of what he said about Caitlin.
We have this abortion activist acting as a doctor with a history of failing to report. So we're gathering the information, we're gathering the evidence as we speak, and we're going to fight this to the end.
Abortion activist acting as a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty visceral reaction to that description. And I mean, I'm sure people describe us like that. But I think being in this moment, caring for people every day who need this care, if you don't speak out, it's just, right, it's not an option. Like you have to advocate. And being an advocate does not make you an activist. We're doctors first, and part of our job as doctors is to make sure our patients are getting the best care possible. And when there are laws prohibiting people from getting the best care possible, it means we have to speak out.
It also implies that she's not a doctor, and she in fact is a doctor. And it's especially ironic because states frequently fund crisis pregnancy centers where it is literally people acting as a doctor who are not doctors and are anti-abortion activists.
Yeah. And it's also especially ironic because regionally she is like seen as such an important expert. People go to her for advice. Like she's pretty amazing in her work.
It should be noted also that Todd Rokita was subsequently sanctioned by the Indiana Supreme Court for those statements. But this campaign had a really adverse effect on Dr. Bernard's life when I think we would all agree that she was doing the right thing.
Once Kentucky was closed, then it was like about trying to just like work really hard to get as many patients seen in Bloomington as possible. And at the same time, knowing that our governor was going to call a special session in the Indiana legislature to get an abortion ban passed. And so at that point, it was like I was on maternity leave still, but I was like working the entire time trying to draft like evidence to send to legislators about what a ban would look like, both on the university side in terms of education for our OBGYN residents and medical students. What would that look like on the healthcare system side? What would be looking at like what is an abortion? What are complications in early pregnancy that require abortion that are not quote unquote induced abortions? Because the way that Indiana law reads, you could actually interpret it to include ectopic pregnancies. And so trying to explain, like all of this medical terminology to legislators, to like hoping against hope that they would even read the fucking document, like care enough to try to clarify the law, to not include things like that. And then a lot about exceptions. And that was really hard because we didn't know what exceptions we were going to get. And the whole like, do you even try to get exceptions? The incrementalism associated with that potential harm, and then also the need for them because you can't, take care of people if it's illegal. One of the things that was really kind of very scary and made it very real. We had a meeting. This was it in the end of July or August? It was before the special session. It was in preparation for that. It was like the hospital lobbyist and the ACOG lobbyist and myself. And they were basically just trying to get meetings with as many legislators as possible so we could get in front of them and have a conversation of like, this is what this law is going to mean. This is what these are the things that we absolutely need. We absolutely need you to clarify, that this does not include ectopic pregnancy. We absolutely need exceptions, not just for life endangerment, because we cannot figure out exactly when somebody is going to die or not, but also health. We need exceptions for lethal fetal anomalies, et cetera, basically as much as we can get. And we go into it's just like very small, like a very unnecessarily small, unconfined space with this guy, an unnamed Republican legislator in Indiana. And he said, they introduced me, an OBGYN. And he was like, oh, don't worry, we'll just put you in jail for 10 years. Just right off the bat, first thing he said to me in the beginning of the meeting. And it's just so crazy. It's just like, how can we be here? I'm like literally have a baby at home, I said, that's not funny. That's not funny. Like he was like joking. And it was very hard because it was like, that might be the end of the meeting. Like I may have no more influence here, but like, I'm not going to just take that. And you think that that's okay. It just makes it so clear what the stakes are in a way that means we cannot lay down. We have to keep fighting this because it is so wrong. It is so dangerous. They will stop at nothing. That in some ways, I think it's empowering to fight on a new level. I, in like some world, would love to have a normal job that I can just go to and then I can like go home. But that's not what this is. This is almost like all consuming, and I have no separation between my work and my life. So in some ways it's like, oh, it would be so nice to it not to feel like such a life or death thing that I have to be all consumed by it. But like when you say things like that, then it really makes it very clear that it is, because when you're looking at like, what are the repercussions of this situation? It's not like somebody tells you your boss reprimands you. You know what I mean? It's not like even like you lose your job and you have to find a new one. It's like you go to jail for 10 years. That's insane. It's absolutely insane. So it's very, there's just like a personal level of this work that I can't really imagine that anybody else has. Now we have these exceptions, right? So I have to figure out for every single patient if their health condition rises to the level of the way that the law is written, which is risk of permanent impairment of a major bodily function. And sometimes it's very clear, but I learned very quickly as soon as our ban went into effect that actually most of them are very not clear. The way it goes down is essentially, I say, yes, I think that it meets the criteria. Usually I have another person certify that as well to kind of back me up. I do their abortion. Then I have to send a report about that abortion to the health department. In that report, it includes the reason for the abortion, as well as lots of information, personal health information about that person and the procedure. And then every 2 weeks, the health department sends that to Indiana Right to Life, because they have a standing Freedom of Information Act request for all terminated pregnancy reports. Does it include HIPAA identifiers? Yes. So then the Indiana Right to Life can decide, I don't think that reason is good enough. I'm going to send a complaint to the Attorney General's office. And then they can start an investigation into me and that procedure.
So when I first heard this part of Caitlin's interview, I was totally floored.
It's bonkers.
Totally bonkers. That, someone without any medical knowledge could question every single case that Caitlin took care of. So to be under that microscope of scrutiny, of course, you're going to make sure you've done everything correctly in your practice. And I think it has this intense chilling effect on doctors, right? Because doctors are rule followers. We don't want to go to jail. And if we are under that level of scrutiny when we're providing care, there are a lot of gray areas in medicine. But when we care for someone and we say that their life is at risk, I mean, I'm a medical expert and I can say that in my expertise and my experience. Someone else could come around and judge what I have to say or my perspective or my view of medicine or patient care. And there's no there's no test, right? Like that you could come in and take a test. It's like, okay, your pregnancy is going to kill you. Like pee on this stick will tell you if your pregnancy is going to kill you. There's a spectrum of risk.
The chilling effect is really real too.
Yeah.
We know from practicing that it's a really effective tactic that states have used to keep people from providing abortion by making it administratively very complicated to do. Yeah. And if you think about, what's a form that's like the way people fill out forms, like a form at the DMV, what would be something that's approachable that everyone has to fill out?
The forms like to get your passport.
Yeah. So if you think about just imagine someone looking over your passport application with a fine-tooth comb to figure out whether you left out a letter of the street name or something like that, or if you had to report a past address, that you maybe got the zip code wrong on a past address, and then being at risk of being fined, getting a ding on your medical license, or going to jail because you left out an R. That's the equivalent of what the Right to Life is doing to providers in Indiana.
And so, in this instance, one really positive thing that happened is that by Caitlin speaking out about the ridiculousness of these requests and the potential risk to her patients' privacy by releasing these reports to someone who has no business being in their medical records or understanding their medical information, the state of Indiana actually dismissed this records request lawsuit from this Right to Life group, and now those reports are no longer released.
I mean, it's so wild that essentially your anti-abortion club is just going to look over your medical records about whether, about what happened during your abortion care. That's outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and people probably don't realize that that's necessarily happening either. So if someone has a Freedom of Information Act request for a report that has maybe not your name on it, but it has enough information to figure out who you are, I mean, I would be pretty upset about just anyone having my information. And so, it's our obligation as medical providers to speak out when something like that is happening. And because of her advocacy, she changed that one small aspect of protection for her patients.
Right. And afforded people the privacy that they deserve, just like the basic dignity privacy that they deserve. Yeah. The other thing she talks about that she conveys is how uniquely horrible it is to be criminalized for doing your job, particularly when you're providing compassion, like the best compassionate care in this very difficult setting. I think that's something that's been a recurring theme for both of us in the past couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a physician who provides abortion care, we have to think about, what would happen if we needed a criminal attorney or if we were facing felony charges. Like, these are real things that we were facing as physicians in this post-obs landscape that we weren't facing before. And it is not easy to think about, what could happen if laws were to change and someone were to judge my practice in a way that would make me a criminal. And I've sort of played out the scenario of what it would look like. I'm driving my family to the beach one weekend and maybe I'm driving a little bit over the speed limit. I get pulled over and my license is run and there's a charge against me.
Yeah,
for something.
Yeah, and the warrant doesn't, right, the warrant for arrest doesn't say what you're charged with. So it's not as though that officer who's arresting you is passing judgment about anything. But then you go to jail.
Right. Well, and not only that, I'm taken out of my car, handcuffed in front of my kids and my family, like, for doing my job. You know, Caitlin has been such a brave advocate and has been able, in her role as an advocate in her state, to speak out. We've talked to so many colleagues across the country that are censored, either by their hospital, their institution, or even sometimes self-censoring out of fear of what might happen to them. And in those states, at those institutions, in those places, when you don't have advocates speaking out on your behalf, then policies like releasing these records stay in place. Abortion restrictions stay in place. And I think we feel really lucky that we've been able to advocate for our patients to maintain access to care. And I can't imagine being in a situation where we were censored in that way.
We want to play you a little tape of the hearing, which was a 14-hour hearing where Dr. Bernard had to answer questions in front of the Medical Licensing Board because of this nothing controversy that was stirred up by the Attorney General. And in this clip, she's talking about why she spoke out about this case.
I think that if the Attorney General, Todd Rokita, had not chosen to make this his political stunt, we wouldn't be here today. As part of my advocacy to support access to comprehensive reproductive health care for Hoosiers, I felt it was important for people to understand that they were going to call a special session and that there was a very real possibility that they would pass an abortion ban in Indiana with absolutely no exceptions, and that patients like this one would be forced to leave out of state for abortion care.
So the result of the hearing with Dr. Bernard is that she was fined $3,000 and had a public letter of concern attached to her medical license that will follow her for the rest of her medical career. And one of the interesting things about the hearing was she's only one of 2 physicians in the whole state of Indiana that provides this care to patients with Medicaid. And they deemed that it was important enough to keep her in medical practice caring for vulnerable patients. And that's why one of the reasons why they didn't take away her medical license.
It's a totally politicized hearing from a politicized board. And I mean, evidence of that is that the American Medical Association actually came to speak on behalf and in defense of Dr. Bernard, noting that she had provided exemplary care and that there was no concern in her medical practice.
Right. No concern in her medical practice, and also no concern that she had violated HIPAA,
which is a patient privacy law.
And so at the current moment, we have lots of those complaints working their way through the legal system for all kinds of different, a box wasn't checked that should have been checked, or a box was checked that shouldn't have been checked, or somebody at Indiana Right to Life decided that this abortion wasn't legal. So that's what keeps me up at night, is that process, that if I say, yes, you deserve to have an abortion, I could end up in another medical licensing hearing. And if they decide that it was an illegal, unlawful abortion, I could go to jail and lose my license. If I say, no, we can't do your procedure, then they don't get a procedure. We can do everything that we can to get them out of state, but in the end, that may or may not happen. And so any complications and trauma and, lifetimes lasting because they didn't get the portion that they needed, I feel like on me. And so it's like a catch-22.
Opinions expressed on this podcast are our own. Philanthropy is helping us highlight these stories, and we hope that you'll continue supporting this work by subscribing and sharing the show and getting involved in your local community.
This podcast is executive produced by us, Dr. Bev Gray and Dr. Jonas Swartz, and Jane Marie. Production by Little Everywhere. Thanks to Nick Thorburn, Patrick Ford, and Maker for our score, and Jamal Walton for original artwork. Extra special thanks to everyone who lent their voices and knowledge to the show, especially Dr. Caitlin Bernard.